Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Pathfinder. Recently, on my trip to South Africa, I gifted away the fixed blade knife that I have used more frequently than anything else over the last, 30 years or so. Not that individual knife, but what I'm talking about is the Cold Steel SRK. I've had numerous incarnations of it over the years. I had the original American-made version in Carbon V. I had the later Japanese-made version in Oz 8. I've given them all away, incidentally. I've never broken one or lost one. The SRK just works really well for me, but the one that I gave away recently is the latest version, the type that's made in Taiwan out of Japanese SK5 carbon steel. I was really glad to see the SRK go back to carbon steel, and that was another great knife. In fact, I have one here. It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to my dad. This is the exact same version I gave away. This is the basic standard SRK in SK5 made in Taiwan. This one's only modified in as much as my dad took a file and a stone and put a 90-degree spine on this so that he could strike a ferro rod with it. So I was planning to, upon my return, simply replace my SRK with a new one. They are cheap and plentiful here in the United States. Maybe even an SRK-C. I haven't tried out the compact model yet, and I may do that in the future. But it caused me to think maybe I should take stock of the fixed blade knives I have. Not all of them. I probably own way too many knives. But I have a selection over here of the most practical fixed blade knives I have. I have another selection here, which fits into that same category. But these are all a little bit different, and I think they deserve a video all their own. What I have here, you've probably read the title of this video, Mora Knives That I Have Known. These are mostly Mora knives. They're all Scandinavian or Scandinavian adjacent, and quite appropriately, they all live in this Danish haversack I have here. But as I said, they're mostly Mora knives, and with a couple of outliers over here. I just wanted to go through. This is most of the Mora knives and other Scandi type knives that I have owned. There's actually a few more inbound. I have, I think, 3 more Mora knives on order, and they just didn't arrive before I had to leave to come up here for camp, so that may warrant its own video. So if you're watching this video, you're certainly aware of Mora knives, and you're probably aware that they have become incredibly popular here in the United States over the last 2 decades or so. They've been popular across Europe for much longer than that, and they've been in the United States for a long time and have had a certain amount of acceptance, but not nearly so much as they have today. They're widely recognized as being the best bang for your buck field knife or bushcraft knife, whatever you want to call it, that's available today. So the very first Mora knife I probably ever owned was this Mora Classic. This is the Classic number 1. This is still available today, although the modern version of the Mora knife Classic number 1 has just a carbon steel blade made out of Sandvik C70. Pretty much everything you'll see here up to this point, if it's stainless steel, it'll have a Sandvik 12C27 blade, and if it's carbon steel, it'll have a Sandvik C70 blade. So the modern Mora Classic has a carbon steel C70 blade. This is the older version made by Frost. It's not branded Mora knife, it's branded Frost, and this has a laminated steel blade. I'm not sure what those alloys are, but you had a much harder carbon steel core with 2 much softer and more pliable carbon steel layers on the outside of the blade. And so you end up with a knife. You can clearly see the lamination line here. I'll try to show it on camera. I don't know if I'll be able to show it very well, but I'll give you a close-up look at it. This has a very simple birchwood handle. The blade is typical Mora. You've got a Scandi grind. And this is the sort of camping knife you can do just about anything with. Certainly you can do the broad range of bushcraft with this, and it's going to be useful for all of your camp chores, food prep, you name it. Do keep in mind these have carbon steel blades though, so if you're chopping onions or slicing tomatoes or something else which is particularly corrosive, you're going to want to rinse the blade off right away. I've had this one for probably, I guess, 25 years or so, and it's held up very well. I've sharpened it quite a few times, but the blade is in good condition, no chips or anything like that. And it just comes in this very basic plastic injection molded sheath. It's got this simple molded in belt loop at the top, but the more modern versions of this have a leather belt loop at the top, which is kind of classy looking. These sheaths are nice in that you can simply drop the knife in there and have easy access to it, but if you poke it down in there with a little bit of force, you get enough friction that there's really pretty good retention. You could probably get by in the woods with nothing but this knife. You could probably buy this knife and never own another knife as long as you live, but what fun would that be? So then about 20 years ago, another series of Frost Mora knives came to my attention in the form of the Companion series. I think these were just marketed as clippers back in the day because they had this plastic clip on the back of the plastic sheath. Today I think they're still referred to as the Clipper or the Clipper Companion. I think these were just called clippers, and they were made by the original Frost's company before the merger of the two companies. And I became aware of these because a local Crossroads gas station / tackle shop / sandwich shop up here in Maine started selling these. They were in a little cardboard display rack right next to the cash register, and they came in two flavors. You had this one, which was olive drab and black, and has a stainless steel blade of 12C 27, typical Scandinavian grind. And you had this one, which had a red handle with black rubber overmolding and a black sheath, and it was in carbon steel. I think these sold for $11 at the gas station, and these sold for $12, so it was $1 more for stainless steel. Really, given the choice between stainless and carbon in these Sandvik steels, I really prefer the stainless because I don't see a huge difference in ease of sharpening and edge holding capability. But these are quite rust resistant, and these are extremely prone to rust. So really, given the choice between the two, I'll take the stainless steel version. So these two, I bought a bunch of these at the gas station. These are actually good gas station knives, but I bought several of these, and I still have one of each in brand new unused condition, and I'm not going to use them. I'm just sort of saving these for posterity. I have one of the stainless steel versions, however, and this one's exactly the same as this. This one has the last 4 digits of my social security number and my name on the back of the sheath. So I'm not going to show you the back of the sheath. Probably just being paranoid, but if you know what this is about, then you know what this is about. I carried this knife quite a bit when I was in the Army. Mora actually, or Frost, actually supplied knives to the Swedish military, and we'll take a look at this one next. But when I was in the Army, my unit had a policy. Obviously, every soldier carries a folding knife in their pocket with a pocket clip on it almost everywhere they go, something like this Rat Model 1. That's pretty common practice. I don't know of too many soldiers that don't carry a knife. But fixed blade knives were a little bit different story. Different units had different policies on fixed blade knives. In my unit, if you were out in the field, you were allowed to carry a fixed blade knife. And it needn't have been issued to you, but it did have to be a knife of U.S. military issue. So something that had been issued to soldiers by the U.S. military, you were allowed to carry in the field when we were on bivouac. But if you brought something small and unobtrusive that probably nobody would even notice, you could get away with it no problem. And this was my knife of choice for a long time. If you watch a lot of video reviews of the Mora Companion, you're going to see a lot of these guys have paracord wrapped around the sheath so that they can, I think mostly because it looks cool to them, but also so that you have some spare paracord when you're in the field. This knife I used to have, and I wish I still had, electrical tape wrapped all around the sheath. And the reason for that was I was a radio operator, and more specifically, I was a 31 Charlie, which proves that I am very, very old. 31 Charlie was the MOS for radio teletype operators. We didn't have any radio teletype machines anywhere near my unit. I never saw a radio teletype machine after I got out of radio school. So I spent most of my time fixing radios in the vehicles, tuning radios, setting up antennas, tuning antennas, and standing radio watches. So I spent a lot of time sitting in Humvees on radio watch in the middle of the night, in the pitch dark, out in the forest, and I always kept some spare electrical tape wrapped around my sheath so that when I needed to tape up something, I could just peel it off of here and cut it off. But I kept this generally clipped to my LBE because I'm sitting in a Humvee on radio watch and I'm fiddling around with stuff, or I might want to cut open an MRE or cut open a Slim Jim or something like that, and having the knife right here where I could get to it quickly and put it back away was very, very convenient rather than fiddling around, sitting down in a Humvee, fiddling around in my pocket trying to fish out my pocket knife. This was a great knife. It didn't draw a lot of attention, and it got everything done that I needed it to do. So that's my history with the Mora Companion. I have a couple more, as I said, I have a couple more Mora knives coming. One of them is a newer Companion. So the next knife I want to take a look at is the last of the Frost's Mora knives that I have. And this is the Swedish Army knife. It has a blade that's very similar to that on the Mora Companion. It's a little bit wider. It has a little bit more of a clip point here as opposed to a straight spine, but basically it's the same. 2.5 millimeter thick blade of 12C27 Sandvik stainless steel. And I think a lot of these were used in the Swedish military as well, the Companions. But this one was official issue. I believe the current Swedish Army knife is from Falkniven. Maybe it's the S1 or the F1, something like that. I'm not very familiar with Falkniven models. But this is another great field knife. I really like the fact that this has the hard plastic handle with no rubber overmolding. I like the shape of it. It's got a lanyard hole here in the end of the handle, which most Mora knives do not. And it came with a similar sheath, but this sheath is ambidextrous. So you can put the knife in that way, or you can put the knife in that way, which you can't do with a lot of the other Mora knives out there. So if you're a lefty, you can put it on this side. If you're a righty, you can put it on this side. It just has a very simple plastic belt loop up here. Anything that can be said about the Mora Companion can be said about this one. Just a really nice basic knife. Sweden's been a neutral country for a very long time. This is by no means meant to be a combat knife. I think your average Swedish soldier is finding himself using this for food prep, maybe starting a campfire, something like that, rather than sneaking around and sticking people. And although I very much doubt that anybody from Mora Knife is going to see this video, this is one model I would love to see them bring back. Maybe with a 3.5 millimeter blade instead of the 2.5 millimeter blade to make it a little bit more heavy duty. But just a very cool knife. Certainly good for the broad range of camp tasks and bushcraft tasks. But another knife that I don't really use anymore because they don't make it anymore, and this is the only one I have. So the first Mora knife that I bought after the Mora knife merger was the Mora knife 2000. I think it's actually called the Outdoors 2000. And it was the first really new and different model after the Mora knife merger. I think Mora knife was trying to make a name for itself and branch out into new things. As you can see, it has a very distinctive design. The sheath, I think, is meant to resemble one of the older, more traditional sheaths, which I guess were made out of birch bark or something. It has this sort of weird texturing on it. It also has the weird texturing on this baby poo green rubber overmolded handle, and it's got a blade which has become kind of familiar now. It's the same blade that I think is on the Cans Bowl, although the Cans Bowl has a bit different handle than this. But you've got about 2 inches of straight edge blade here with your standard Scandi grind on it. Then the blade becomes much thinner. It goes down from 2.5 millimeters to maybe 1.5 millimeters or 2 millimeters. So you've got these tapered bevels on each side, and the edge becomes much thinner. And this was the first kind of different knife that Mora came out with. So you've got the straight Scandi, which is fine for feather sticking and other bushcrafting tasks. But this curved part of the blade out front is much finer. I have sharpened this many times, and I've maintained the Scandi edge on this straight section. Where it gets much thinner out here towards the front, I have put a sort of a convex Scandi on it, which makes it easier to tune up, easier to sharpen, and gives me a little bit more control when I'm slicing, doing food prep, things like that. This is an interesting knife. It's a bit more expensive. I think last I saw these were selling for about $30. And I think something important to remember about Mora knives in general is once you get to about $30, that's where I would stop buying Mora knives. There are Mora knives now that range up well north of $100. And I think, honestly, once you get up to $100 plus, there are better knives out there. The whole point of Mora is to have a really good, very solid quality knife for a very, very reasonable price. And this is about as much as I would spend. Yes, it's different. Yes, I like this knife. Yes, I've carried it a lot. Do I think it has a lot to offer over, say, the Mora Companion? I don't really. The thin tip on this is nice for cutting up food, things like that, but there's really nothing you can do with this knife that you can't do with a Companion, and you can buy 2 of these for the cost of 1 of these. So this really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but it is still a nice knife, and I'm not going to stop using it. Oh, another thing is too, you may have noticed the blade on this is quite has sort of a dull matte finish. This was extremely high polish when I got it, and it just looked too flashy. I thought it reflected too much light. So I ended up putting the knife in my blasting cabinet and glass bead blasted both sides of the blade to give it this dull matte finish. You're not going to get one like that from the factory, but I think it's a little less garish looking. So those are all of my older Mora knives, most of which are sort of semi-retired at this point, with the exception maybe of the 2000, but these older Companions and the Classic are out of production and too valuable to me sentimentally for me to take them out and beat on them much in the woods, which brings us to our more modern selection of knives here. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that most of you are at least somewhat interested in watching knife videos on YouTube. And I think most of you are probably then familiar with the Joe X channel. Now, the testing that Joe X does, I don't think it's very entertaining, and I enjoy his videos a lot. I don't know that the way he tests knives really translates to how well a knife is going to hold up under average use. But he recently posted a video of the 20 most indestructible knives he's ever tested. And out of the top 3, 2 of the most indestructible knives he's ever tested are left on this table. We'll push these aside for the moment And what we're talking about are these two knives. Now, considering the fact that a lot of the knives that Joe X tests are hundreds and hundreds of dollars, he's got custom makers sending him their knives basically for destruction testing. If you put your knife in Joe X's hands, he is going to make it fail. He'll probably break it. But these two knives, each of which, I just looked on Amazon this morning, each of these you can get for $16 and change on Amazon right now. Joe X was unable to break either of these two knives. And what we have here is the Mora knife Robust and the Hultafors GK. Both of these have very thick blades, much thicker than on my older Mora knives. These blades are 3.5 millimeters thick as opposed to 2.5 millimeters thick. They're both made from carbon steel. The Mora knife Robust is based on the Mora knife Pro series, which is based on the Mora knife Basic series. And this is made from carbon steel, so it's C70 carbon steel. Again, your basic Mora knife Scandinavian grind, but this is extremely heavy duty. I think by the end of Joe X's testing, he had both of these knives bent at like a 90-degree angle, but he wasn't able to break either of them. Does that make a whole lot of difference? Probably not. A knife that's bent at a 90-degree angle is just as useless as one that's broken. Actually, maybe more useless, because you could take a broken blade and still use it, whereas a blade that's bent like a horseshoe is probably not useful at all. It's very, very robust. It fits well in the hand. Anything you can do with the thinner Mora knives, you can do with this. It might be a little bit less effective at slicing than one of the thinner blades, but you can certainly feather stick with this. You can do the broad range of bushcraft tasks as well as all of your camp chores with it. The Hultafors GK is a completely different company. Hultafors is also a Swedish company, like Mora knife, but they're more of a garden supply house than they are a cutlery company. And this knife is not actually made in Sweden, nor does it actually have a Scandinavian grind on it. It has sort of a Scandi grind, but then it has a very pronounced secondary bevel on the edge. So you sharpen this as you would any other knife. Although Hultafors is a Swedish company, this knife is actually made in Taiwan, and it's made out of SK5 carbon steel, Japanese SK5. So it's very, very similar in that respect to the cold steel SRK. But in practice, it's virtually indistinguishable from the Mora knife Robust. These are both extremely heavy-duty knives. The Robust has a bit finer point on it. I would probably be less inclined to do serious prying, although, again, Joe X was unable to break the tip off of this knife. The Hultafors GK, on the other hand, has an extremely blunt tip. This thing is basically a sharpened crowbar. I'm sure you could pry up a manhole cover with this knife without doing any damage to the tip. These two knives are very similar. The Mora knife is probably made a little bit nicer, and it has a proper Scandi grind. The Hultafors is a little bit more rough and tumble, but I think if I were inclined to be using this as a trade knife, if I was a drywaller or I was putting up tile, things like that, I would probably choose the Hultafors over the Mora knife just because of the very robust tip on it. The Mora knife has a plastic sheath, which is similar in concept to the companion clipper. It also has a clip that'll slide over your belt or the top of your pocket. The knife goes in there, snaps in quite securely. You've got this thing on the front, this little stud that looks like the retainer for a bayonet scabbard frog. It is in fact meant to clip into this little recess on the clip on the back of the sheath. This allows you to piggyback more than one knife off the same hanging point. So if you had this hanging off your belt, you could have another knife of slightly different design hanging off of it, and presumably another one and another one. I don't know why you would daisy chain knives like this, but apparently it's a thing, so that's kind of cool. The Haltefors has a sheath that's a little bit more controversial. A lot of people have criticized this for having a very, very poor belt loop on it. And the reason for that is it's not a belt loop. What it is a retainer that's sort of common on European work knives. This is never meant to be a belt loop. What it is it's a button hanger. If you go to Europe, you'll see most of the tradesmen wearing these royal blue overalls, and they have buttons for the shoulder straps. The idea behind this knife is you can put the button on your overall through that hole, pull it down, then snap this shut. It has two little clips on it, and your knife will be hanging right here where you can get to it easily. You can also attach it to other buttons elsewhere on your uniform, but that's what that's for. There are ways of adapting this to a belt loop. I'm not going to go into that at the moment, but you can let your imagination run wild. I've seen people on Etsy and eBay selling little belt loops with buttons on them specifically to go with knives like this. How far into this are we? 41 minutes. And that brings us to our last two Scandinavian adjacent knives. I say Scandinavian adjacent because this knife is from Russia, which is definitely not Scandinavian. And this knife is from Finland, and a lot of Finns bristle at being called Scandinavian, although a lot of Finland is on the Scandinavian peninsula, but they're definitely ethnically and culturally and linguistically distinct from the true Scandinavian countries. So this is a Finnish puukko knife. This one is made by a company called Ahti, A-H-T-I, and this one is specifically the Ahti Tika, which means woodpecker in Finnish. And you can see there's a little woodpecker on the leather sheath. Another really great little utility knife. Same Scandinavian grind, although it has a bit thicker blade. I would say this one's probably 3.5 millimeters instead of 2.5 millimeters. Nice little leather sheath, plastic liner inside. Anything you can do with a Mora knife, you can do with this thing. This is a little bit more expensive. You're going to spend, I think on Amazon you can buy this particular model for about $40. But the broad range of camp tasks and bushcrafting tasks you can get done just fine with this knife. Much like the Mora Classic, you can put it in the sheath kind of loosely where it's easy to get out, or you can give it a little shove and then it's retained in the sheath pretty well. Brass ferrule here with the stick ting riveted over. Just another cool little knife. And last but not least, we've got our honorable mention. This knife, as I said, is made in Russia. This is from Kislyar Supreme, which is out of St. Petersburg, Russia. Obviously, things aren't going very well, and relations between Russia and the West have gotten about as bad as they can get. These knives are not currently available on the U.S. market. Who knows if they ever will be again. But this is the Kislyar Forester, and I included this because I really like this knife. Despite what you may think of Russia, or what your feelings might be about Russia, this is a great little bushcrafting knife, or camp chores knife. It has a thick blade. I would say this is probably at least 4 millimeters in thickness. It's made from Böhler N690, so it's a little bit higher end steel than anything else we've looked at so far. It's a stainless steel from Germany. It's cobalt modified, so it's very tough and very hard. This thing takes and holds an edge very well. I bought it as a bare blade a few years ago, and I made these linen micarta scales for the handle. I couldn't find Corby bolts that were the right size to hold this on, so I ended up buying bolts from Essie. They sell Corby bolts as spares. They were a little bit too large in diameter to go through the holes in the blade blank, however. And I tried floating out the holes in the Bowler N690 blade with cobalt drill bits and made absolutely zero headway. So I ended up actually chucking up these Corby bolts in the lathe and turning down the shafts on them ever so slightly so that they would fit through the holes in the blade. But this is a great knife. It holds an edge very well. It's got this convex Scandi grind, so it's easy to sharpen, and you can feather stick with this thing. The convex Scandi grind does mean that it's a little bit thick behind the edge, but you can still use this for food prep. It slices reasonably well. This is just another great knife that I've been really happy with. It's actually one of my favorite knives to take in the field. I bought the sheath separately, but it did come from Kislyar Supreme, and it's a really nice leather sheath with a little dangler here. I don't really know what's up with the fake crocodile skin texturing on the sheath. That's a little weird. And I could do without the giant Kislyar Supreme branding on here as well. And also the web address, which incidentally, this is www.kislyarsupreme.com. This website doesn't even work anymore for obvious reasons. If you put in www.kislyarsupreme.ru, that website does work, but this one's been shut down ever since the war started. And it doesn't really matter because these knives aren't available anymore either. It did have a loop on the side for a fire steel, which I put in there. But that's a moot point for the moment because I have not yet had a chance to put a 90-degree edge on the spine of the knife for striking a fire steel. So that's just a quick look at all of my Scandinavian and Scandinavian adjacent knives, mostly Mora knives. I have been recording for 45 minutes. I hope to God I can edit this video down to a much more reasonable and manageable size. Then I can start working on the next one. Hope to see you all then. Later, guys.